Welcome, everybody, to Closing the Gaps by Modernizing Legal Document Management from Print to Productivity in the Cloud. I am honored to be facilitating this conversation today with industry leaders Mike Verdello, the Global Head of IT Transformation and Enterprise Operations at Baker McKenzie, Peter James, a Senior Partner at Group, and David Leong, the Chief Technology Officer at Group. Gentlemen, great to see you.
Great to see
Thank
you,
you, Ari.
Ari.
Thanks for being here.
So I'm lucky to be doing this for a second time. We have a series here focusing on key trends that are happening in our space. And as you know, I do a tremendous amount of research that's focused on where firms are, how they relate to their clients, and where technology fits into a dynamically changing marketplace. So the first thing that I want to try to address in terms of setting the foundation for what we're going to talk about today is that all of the research has been showing that law firm leaders highlight document workflows as a barrier to efficiency, client responsiveness, and compliance. Mike, I'd love to start with you. What does modernizing the document experience mean for a global law firm, and where should teams really begin that process?
Yeah, thank you, Ari. As I think about that question, I think there's a two-part answer. I think first, they're the basics, right? How easy is it to create, collaborate, access the information? What security practices you have around that information? And then what is the convenience factor? How do people want to access this information? Is it via mobile devices? Is it hard copies through being able to print across your enterprise environment? And ultimately, does the strategy meet the client expectations? Things like regionalization. And then I think that there is another component. As firms take their data strategy a little bit more seriously and begin to adopt things like data governance, a modern document experience starts to include things like automation and AI, where the content that is actually being produced inside these systems has the potential to drive revenue and increase margins in other practice areas of business.
As I'm listening to you, I'm typing and I'm just thinking how you are able to, which I think is super interesting from a law firm leader standpoint, about does strategy meet expectations? How do you modernize a document management and a document experience with automation and AI, and also from a revenue generation standpoint? Now, Peter, what is driving law firms now to reassess how they engage in this process, manage their documents and their content?
I think a big driving force lately has been the hybrid work environment, right? Hybrid work models are really driving firms to look at accessibility a little bit differently to documents. You look as an industry, and the legal industry was really one of the earliest adopters of electronic document management systems. Despite that fact, there's still a heavy reliance on paper. But even more of a problem, I think, for a lot of firms other than the paper is the documents that have been squirreled away in all the different shared network folders, network drives, as well as people's local computers, right? And attorneys have often done that because they want to make sure that they're able to access their information from anywhere that they are. They want to be able to access it from the office, from home, from a client's office, as well as from court. And so that's really driving firms to start to look at things a little bit differently and figure out how they can start to bring all of that a little bit more together, more cohesive for the end users.
It's funny how we're talking about accessibility and the ability to increase revenue when you modernize the document experience, and yet there's still some confusion. So David, what's the biggest misconception law firms have about the state of their document ecosystem?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ari. And, Peter and Mike have raised some really, really good points regarding a document ecosystem. And depending on who you ask, I think the The common misconception with law firms is that implementing a document management system automatically ensures information management, security, compliance, and efficiency. However, from my observation in practice, firms often grapple with multiple disconnected information repositories, which complicates search, retrieval, compliance, and security of information. More importantly, inconsistent work practices, processes emerge from staff that rely on personal storage habits. This has been going on for decades now, and not surprisingly, many users still use Microsoft Outlook, OneDrive as their primary information stores, reinforcing fragmentation rather than resolving it.
Mike, I feel like given the depth of your experience and all your leadership positions, David's point about implementing a system isn't necessarily a solution must resonate from an organizational standpoint.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I'm a foundation first person, right? Strong foundation, strong house, and understanding your current landscape, understanding your business workflows. These are core components in the preparation phase for a modern document management solution.
So let's pick up on that, because the challenge that Peter and David are really trying to highlight is that many professionals are spending too much of their time looking for information. I find that this to be a significant issue in the workplace. As someone that practiced for nearly 9 years, the idea of poor document management, productivity, these issues just kept compounding. So when we're talking about foundational readiness, and we're kind of going from modernizing the document experience to kind of foundational readiness, what does that look like from a strategy standpoint, and how do firms get started? David started talking about this, but how do you get started in this assessment process to go from where you are to where you really need to be?
Right. So, Ari, I think we just touched on this, right? It's understanding the current landscape. You have to understand your challenges, and you also have to understand your costs. And I go back to understanding the business workflows and how they expect to work. Do you have strong policies around things like security and retention? I think, these are all kind of fundamental and foundational items. I think that the other mistake in foundational readiness is putting the tool before the understanding of the process. And it's with technology now transforming on a daily basis, it's what's the new and hot thing out there. And I think that we forget sometimes, and I've fallen victim to this, of where are we trying to go, and understanding and mapping those things out before we decide to pick a tool. And look, I've worked with groups, teams like At Group, who have come in. I've leveraged them in the past in our document management space in organizations. They have the expertise. They can help walk us through. They've helped walk us through those types of understandings, and those planning factors that we have to take into consideration on the foundational level before moving forward with a solution.
Peter, with that in mind, this idea of avoiding tool before process seems very fundamental, and why I'm sure Mike is talking about it as foundational readiness. But you mentioned things having changed in a hybrid environment, that the pandemic served as sort of a flashpoint, and then this sort of repositioning. How have post-pandemic document workflows evolved?
It's interesting, because I think what Mike just brought up is a great point. And I think some of the things where the pandemic really illustrated that is, since the pandemic, there's a number of document workflows where firms have had the technology for years to do that electronically, but there was nothing precipitating or moving them to action, right? And the biggest examples for me are pre-bills and pro formas. Prior to the pandemic, when we were deploying print solutions to law firms, your biggest print environment would be the accounting finance department, because they were printing thousands and thousands of pages in a 1 to 2 day period for pre-bills and then the final bills. Most firms, especially in the AML 100, 200 that I worked with, already had that technology to allow the attorneys to mark it up. But no, the attorneys wanted to take that document to Starbucks with them and mark up the pre-bills there and then give it back instead of marking up a PDF. Another great example is just letters, simple letters. For years and years and years, when firms are writing a letter to co-counsel, client, they would create the letter, they would take a scanned copy of the letter, they would email it as a PDF, but they would then put it into an envelope, put a stamp on it, and mail it out. And we really have seen that since the pandemic, not across the board, not all practice areas, but for the most part, letters are going electronically. There's not nearly as much letterhead being consumed, not nearly as many pre-printed envelopes being consumed. It's still an important factor, but overall, all of this has really resulted in a large decrease in the overall print volume in firms since the pandemic. And it really is just simply taking tools that you've had and now being able to put that process around them. The part I find a little bit funny with all that, though, is the print environment itself for most firms hasn't changed in that process. You still see the 2 LAA stations with 1 printer between them. You see shared printers right next to multifunction devices. So now what you have is all of these devices that are each doing a much lower volume, as opposed to looking at streamlining that process and really designing a print environment and a scanning environment that matches your current reality.
Yeah, Ari, if I could just interject on Peter's comment, because it is relevant, and as I've had experience across multiple law firms now, I've experienced this personally. This is really a large opportunity for return on investment. And I people at print, it's paper, it's consumables, it's devices. But I often joke around that many law firms, they produce paper. That's a lot of times that's their product. And I think that the efficiency gains in the printing space, even though it sometimes can sound like a boring area, the efficiencies that can be gained in the printing space, in my experience, has led to really cost efficiencies in the millions of dollars over years. So I know it's, who wants to bother with print, but I think that if you look over the terms in my past experiences, yeah,
I do.
Yeah, right. And that's, again, that's another area I've leveraged at groups. In a 4-year span, you're talking about multiple millions of dollars inside of an organization of savings. So it's not insignificant.
Peter, I have to tell you that I practiced for nearly 9 years with large law firms in New York City. And at my very first job, we used to print certain correspondence on different colored paper so that we flipped through the file, we would know which letters went to the client and which different things. And now the idea of sending something, if I send someone a thank you card, a handwritten thank you card, they'll then send me a note, thank you so much. And now I try to have this dilemma of, do I now have to send a you're welcome card? Because it's so unusual. It's so unusual to have print. But Mike's point about
Absolutely.
this idea of, an opportunity for a return on investment is super interesting. So David, now back to you. What are the challenges of navigating between the client side and the business side workflows so that we kind of can create these efficiencies and advantages?
Yeah, navigating between client side and business side workflow presents several challenges because you're essentially balancing the priorities of the practice of law and the business of law here. So with the practice of law, we're usually driven by client demands, often prioritized by speed, responsiveness, and know-how. And while the business of law focuses on compliance, accuracy, and risk management. Now, balancing these competing demands is extremely tricky in a document management system because in most cases, legal document management systems are primarily built and designed for the practice of law, aiming to capture the essential elements of legal practice workflows, documents, matters, case files for all practice areas. However, from the business of law, the standpoint there, these systems often fall short aligning with broader operational needs, creating a product solution mismatch with the use case and requirements. So back to Mike's point of, providing a tool before the process. Sure, we've got this notion, this legal document management system has been designed and built for a legal process, but does it really span all the different practice areas of a law firm? Because they're not all the same. And does it take into account the business of law, where areas like finance, HR don't really care about the categorization of case files, matters, practice areas. So it becomes, are you providing the right tool for everyone in the firm?
I felt like someone was going to say something. Were you going to say something, Mike?
I was
Yeah, yeah.
actually, because I think Peter and David, again, from the practical side, the customer side, the other challenge, and Peter said this earlier, law firms have been doing document management for a long time, and there is already a heavy existing investment in those solutions, right? And so the challenge for technology leaders because of business pressure is, all right, how do I take those existing investments and modernize them without having to do a rip and replace? And it is a very real problem right now, as I said earlier, as the technology landscape is changing on almost a daily basis with new tools available. Foundation first. That's why it's so critical for you to understand at least your primary revenue driving processes. And from my perspective, starting with that.
So I've been lucky to publish over 60 different kind of research reports on the legal space over the last 15 years, many of them touching on technology. And Mike, you know, it's interesting that we started about modernizing your document process, then figuring out foundational readiness, and now you're talking about legacy systems. Don't rip them out. What should you do? And I often ask the question, what percentage of your system do you actually take advantage of? And frankly, that number is usually pretty low. And how well versed are people in your systems to the point where, well, we'd rather it completely automated because people don't know how to use this or that. And so, we get to this point of getting to an easier and easier kind of situation. And I think the modernizing of this is an issue. And Mike, before I leave you, and we talked about ripping it out and what it is, and you said tool before process. Where do the people fit into this equation? Because we're talking about technology, how critical it is. We're talking about the process, but organizations, particularly large, prestigious organizations like yours, have an exceptional talent, have a certain culture. How do you kind of align these things in an effort to, move things forward?
It's a broad question. I think it's organizational dependent for sure, and there is no magic bullet. I will say that people and process are generally, in my experience, where the challenge is derived from, which then, of course, tends to lead to the technology challenges, especially around security and efficiency for multinational law firms that have to deal with jurisdictional regulation, regionalization, all of these components, and really, and data security policies changing in countries like China and GDPR regulations. These are all things that I find in my own personal experience that become more reactionary on our side because of the amount of time we have to adopt. But I do believe that it's really it comes down to trying to align the people and process as best as you can. I think most law firms least the ones that I've had experience with, do deal with legacy, deal with legacy applications, right? You know, law firms are generally an amalgamation through combinations, and when you do one of those combinations, the first priority is that the firm does not want, they want to continue to generate revenue out of that combination day two. And so now you're sometimes left with disparate systems. I think we talked about that earlier. David mentioned on that earlier. So these are, you know, these are real challenges that sometimes have to be dealt with in real time.
Well, so Peter, what about that? You know, this is so interesting that we're talking about the growth of legal, because the industry has just exploded in terms of revenue, in terms of headcount, in terms of opportunities, the market, the expansion. What are the operational and security risks that firms may be overlooking when they're making this leap?
You know, I think there's, Mike just touched on a bunch of areas around from a security standpoint, right? When it comes to the network and making sure when you are, especially a global firm, that you're compliant with the different regulations like GDPR in different parts of the world. You know, I think firms spend a lot of times looking at things like making sure they've got the correct ethical walls in place. And the one that always, you know, that there are some just things that they completely overlook, like paper sitting in printer trays in public areas within a firm, right? So you've got all these ethical walls in place, and then you go to the printer and there's could be confidential information sitting right there in the printer. I think on top of that, when you look at the pace with which firms are merging um, and growing, you are seeing situations where, you know, a firm might be opening up an office but not quite ready to put all aspects of their network in that office the same way they have other places, or early days of a merger. And being able to look at tools, you know, like cloud-based systems for being able to enable scanning and printing, a lot of times that can really help speed up that growth within the, you know, within the firm. I think the operational efficiencies that you can gain by moving to a more flexible solution um, often get you some pretty big gains. And the other one, you know, you mentioned China, Mike, like that's another advantage, where if you had the advantage of being able to completely segment off your printing and scanning and other aspects by leveraging cloud, you know, it just gives that extra peace of mind. And that's something we're having a lot of conversations with our global clients around right now.
David, you talked about balancing the practice of law with the business of law. And in your role and what you're seeing on a global level, how can chief information officers, chief technology officers, those who are responsible for these really prominent infrastructure level decisions, how can they figure out whether their systems are helping with compliance, as Mike and Peter talked about, or really creating a barrier that will end up costing more later?
I think that's a question that would terrify most CIOs. And depending on where they're shining the torch, you know, they probably would like to unsee what they're seeing. Sure, you can take the technology perspective and conduct audits based on critical evaluation criteria to ensure the systems are secure, compliant, optimized, just to give them peace of mind so they can sleep at night. You know, is there regulatory alignment, you know, with compliance standards, you know, data accessibility, audit, reporting capabilities, security measures. But I think the real measure is how effective your document management, as to how effective your document management system is performing against the compliance goals, is how many non-compliant document processes and procedures are taking place within your firm and why this is happening. Now, this goes beyond whether the system is compliant with your goals. It's how it's, again, how it's used. And, you know, Mike has touched on it twice now about how people process information through ease of use, the convenience factor, whether it makes sense, or whether the workflow is being mapped out correctly? Or are there integration issues? Or is it simply just too hard and they don't understand it, so they just don't comply? So it's a question that CIOs, I think, tend to shrug and just take the easy option. And it's like, systems we have are compliant, and they meet the compliance goals for the firm. But it's realistically, it comes down to how these tools are being used.
It sounds like a cross-disciplinary answer and not just a CIO. You have to be the global head of IT transformation and enterprise operations in order to answer a question like that. Mike, I'm just curious, do you find that that holistic experience is really what the modern CIO level individual needs to answer this question between document management and the sort of the readiness, and also these other areas of security and compliance, and as we kind of add to the array of items that are under that responsibility?
In short answer, yes. These are all challenges, and I go back to the foundations first, and not to sound like a broken record, but understanding what your requirements are is paramount. And I realize the challenges around that, right? Because as we talk about modern document strategies, really we're talking about data. And we're now, as I said earlier, we're now trying to fit a lot of legacy things that we've done in these document management systems, that we're trying to now convert those same systems to act in more a modernized way. And there is no substitution for proper planning. There is no substitution for proper planning. And people have tried, and it's been my experience that is, I've seen that consistently. I consistently fail. I understand the challenges of speed to market. I'm under those challenges every single day, but there's never enough money to do it once, but always enough money to do it twice. Kind of applies. So proper planning is really the only thing I can say around that.
Never enough money to do it twice, but always enough money to do it twice. A really super interesting perspective there. So turning to, as we're thinking about all of the different issues of modernizing, of readiness, of legacy systems, and now the sort of triad of ESG, security, global pressures that are really affecting a lot of organizations from a geopolitical standpoint and others. I publish an annual general counsel report, lots of other research on the in-house trends, and there's lots of research that shows that ESG, data governance are issues that are really at the top of the list when evaluating vendors, when trying to assess a certain metric. So, Peter, what role does modernizing document workflows play in ESG initiatives?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of aspects, and we work with a number of AmLaw 100 and 200 firms, both on a local basis as well as a global basis, and I really find that the sustainability initiative is something that is becoming much more important to a firm. I work with one firm, actually based in the UK, where they themselves publish a sustainability report, like a report card on themselves. And I think when we look, especially at print, we always think of the number of pages that are being printed as an aspect of that. But one of the things that we really look at is, there's a number of other factors. I talked about all the different printers that are still sitting in, just having those printers plugged in and in standby mode. When you're looking at a printer that's 8-10 years old, believe it or not, it actually draws more electricity in standby mode than modern multifunction devices do. So full floor size devices do in operation mode from a typical energy consumption. So when you look at the thousands of trees that are needed just to reabsorb the CO2 from the atmosphere for having those devices plugged in. And so some firms I work with, when we're rolling out, part of our change management process with the new offices is we actually have a little 2-page PDF that is the sustainability advantages of this new solution. We compare their existing solution, the energy consumption, as well as the energy consumption on the new solution. The one that drives me absolutely batty, and I mentioned earlier from the security standpoint, is the abandoned prints, right? When we walk into firms and we're doing our initial assessments, every printer you walk by, there's not only the print jobs that have just been sitting in that output tray for however many days, but typically there's a basket on the counter next to the printer that is unclaimed print jobs. And sometimes there's a process to remove those and shred them, but a lot of times those just sit there and pile up over time. You know, we really always, when we're looking at our complete print solution, we're looking at, you know, the savings, security, sustainability, and service are really sort of the four pillars of that process. And that sustainability aspect is something that we do try to put measurements around to help our clients to be able to measure against going forward.
If I could also touch on that one, this was, you know, Baker has a fairly robust sustainability program. And then as I take it back to previous experiences, much of what a law firm produces is it's IP related, it's SPI, it's PII, it's really sensitive information. And one of the biggest benefits that I've gotten in conjunction with working with our CISOs and in our compliance areas is the security around physical documents. You know, we spend so much time locking down access control and RBAC policies within our applications, and then you have hundreds of thousands of pages sitting in a print room, or tens of thousands of pages sitting in a print room with all of that information that you're trying to protect digitally sitting out in the open. And from a sustainability perspective, yeah, you know, we've seen, you know, typically you see what 15-20% just reduction in cost in just consumable products, right? And the shrinking of your printing fleet and making things more consolidated and convenient, but also reducing your carbon footprint from an electricity perspective and all of those good things. But the emphasis on the security, because with the security component does come the convenience aspect too. As you introduce those security controls, people find them cumbersome at first, but because they have to go up to a device and they have to put a pin in, or they have to use their badge to release a printer. But I think over time, in my experience, it actually has been, after a few months, it actually gets received very well, because that same person now realizes they don't have to go to just one printer. If they're, you know, they could be coming back from the lunchroom and realize, oh, wow, I printed something out. Let me just stop at this particular printer, print out my device. And I've used this convenience. You know, I travel internationally. I'm in another office, and I don't have to carry those papers with me in my briefcase, et cetera. I just print them out in the location that I'm going to be at. So it's definitely a security play, because it protects that information and it puts it directly into the hands of the person that printed it in the first place. So that's you know, compliance. That's great, but the convenience, you can't deny the convenience of it either.
How do you facilitate the change management required to get people to avoid duplication? Or, you know, it took me a little while to realize I could just sort of note this on an electronic device and change, you know, as opposed to printing from a sustainability standpoint. Peter mentioned the electricity alone, who most people are probably not thinking about that. I would imagine, while you're doing your work and just need to get something reviewed. Is there any sort of best practice you can share with the listeners about that change management element of printing here or there, or not printing at all?
So I've done this transformation twice in this specific area, and you know, the initial response is generally revolt. You're going to take away my printer, and I think that this is where it's very important to engage your CFO. I think that's a critical path item. It's important to engage your sustainability groups in your organization. It's important to engage your executive management level, because this is not just a solution, it's a strategy. It's a strategy from a sustainability perspective. It's a strategy from a cost perspective. It's a strategy from a security and compliance perspective. And I think that you're not going to please everybody. You're always going to have that one managing partner that you're going to make that exception to, that's going to keep that printer in their particular office. But I think that if you get buy-in at that top level, on the financial level and at the executive management level, it makes the communication, the OCM component back to the organization, it makes it much easier when you have that consistent message regarding the why.
I'm getting a theme here. You said it earlier, you said a tool is not a solution. Now a solution is not a strategy. And so I understand the sort of holistic approach to this and the global nature. David, I just want to, from an ESG, a sustainability, a global standpoint, given the, At Group's global reach, where do you see the connection between the secure access we're talking about and also Mike's point about traveling internationally, being able to access anything you want and being able to have it in front of you? So how do you see that connection between secure access and this global consistency and how legal work is being performed today?
Yeah, well, Mike and Peter have both discussed, the convenience of the traveling user going into different jurisdictions and regions here. And the connection really is just creating that uniform data protection, controlled access, compliance, and operation efficiency that occurs in every office. You got to have it consistent so it's the same. So that way you'll get the user adoption. If you're traveling from New York to London and the London office has got different machines, for example, for print, different methods of releasing print, they don't have follow me print. All these things come into play, and the poor CIO unfortunately just gets hung out to dry because these things aren't all interconnected. So the security, uniform data, protection, standardized security protocols, all come into play with it, a well-planned integrated network architecture. So obviously you have to buy in from many stakeholders to achieve this. And it gets particularly difficult because you're now dealing with multiple offices in different regions that have different priorities and different regulations. So trying to tie all this together, get to achieve this seamless collaboration and include auditing and monitoring of how well it's being run is really challenging. And again, I don't have the silver bullet to I'm probably giving you more questions than answers here, but obviously you have to consider all of these factors to achieve this.
Well, you make a great point, it sounds like, because the fact that you don't have all the answers and the fact that we've been talking about this not being able to be managed entirely with one technology team. And I love the point about getting the CFO involved to bring the financial hammer down to avoid waste and to enhance sustainability is a real interesting best practice here as we think about modernizing, because one of the challenges that seems to come up is people are dissatisfied with some of their tech stack. The integration of their information, of their location, of their devices is an issue. And there was an observation that somebody made recently. I was facilitating a discussion with innovation leaders, and they said, there's a real disconnect between the technology leaders, the IT team, the people who are responsible for infrastructure, whose job has a primary responsibility to make sure that nothing breaks and nothing goes wrong. And yet now so many organizations are focused on driving their future forward at innovation, whose in some ways part of the job is to get it wrong, to make a mistake, to break things in an effort to move things forward. So there's an interesting disconnect there. So Mike, how do you balance the excitement, the enthusiasm of individuals, of practice groups that want to adopt newer tools or maybe shadow IT in that respect, and balance those things with the firm's need for consistency, for centralized systems that allow all these wonderful benefits that we're talking about?
This is a great question. And it's a great question because it's, regardless of what period of technology you're in over the last, let's say, 2 decades, this question is constantly being asked, relevant to where we're at in the technology stack. Look, platforms like Microsoft, they're making it very easy to access and collaborate across their suite of applications. And users, they're taking advantage of these features. I call it prison ingenuity. You know, they'll find a way to put these features into a full-blown critical business process right under IT's nose. And so I think there's no perfect answer to this. My recommendation, and I wish I came up with this recommendation on my own. This recommendation has been drilled into me over the years, is you can't be predisposed to these new solutions. You have to listen to your end users. You know, ultimately, sure, we want to keep the end user base safe, and that's where we have our policies and our controls and our resiliency plans. But you have to listen to how your end users are working. I think that we often find ourselves trying to fit our traditional IT workflow practices and security practices into these new solutions, and you wind up with a square peg round hole scenario. So I think that is I think that, you know, listening and understanding, you know, and it's very similar to crowdsourcing on ideas, right? These end users, they're boots on the ground. They're at the coal face, understanding what their needs are. And I think that sometimes IT leaders, myself included, can get blinders on and not listen or see what these teams are doing, and taking those ideas and really trying to rationalize them on more of an enterprise level, and trying to figure out how to secure them and put policies by them. I'm not saying that run rampant, because that's always an issue, right? Sprawl is always going to be something that is challenging, and it's getting worse. It's getting worse now. Again, as I say, technology is changing every day, but I think this is an area where we need to do a better job, again, my opinion, on listening to our user base and what they're asking for.
Your various recommendations of crowdsourcing and, you know, dealing with the financial aspects of this as a means of driving change are super practical, really, really helpful. Peter, given your perspective, and given this point that you gentlemen have been making about balancing the modern way of working with more traditional productivity aspects of print, what kinds of layered solutions are typically most effective when you're trying to bridge that gap between print and digital workflows?
Well, you know, it's funny because I'm amazed that it still is continuing to grow at the pace that it is, but scanning, just, you know, from a workflow standpoint, when we look at MFD usage, the piece of the pie that scanning is continuing to grow. And I can think, well, as all these workflows digitize, surely at some point you're left with less paper that you actually need to scan. But I think it's maybe that now firms are starting to be able to scan more. They're going to smaller offices. They're wanting to have all of that information available electronic to everyone. I think, you know, the advent of cloud and SaaS-based technology to manage the printing and scanning within firms is a great development, right? In terms of being able to eliminate so much of that on-site infrastructure, being able to eliminate print servers, being able to eliminate scan servers. As firms are starting to leverage OneDrive more and SharePoint more to be able to, you know, enable users to scan directly into it, I'm amazed a number of times when I'm doing these rollouts. You know, you touched on change management before, and honestly, change management is my favorite part of what I do, right? I get to be on site with the actual attorneys, holding their hands as we go live with new solutions. And I'm amazed that as I talk to IT leadership and firm leadership, and they talk about, yeah, big OneDrive initiative, we've been rolling that out. It's still new to most end users. And then you talk to the end users, and a lot of them don't even know they have OneDrive, right? When I show them the scan to OneDrive capabilities of their new solution, it's the first time they had any idea what OneDrive was, right? So being able to help the end users with that, leveraging that new technology that the firm is starting to drive towards, which, the faster you're able to leverage the cloud-based technologies, the faster you can start closing down some of those shared drives that have gotten extremely bloated over the many years of people squirreling away all their documents on your shared drives.
It's so interesting to me that you mentioned this sort of tips and tricks, the idea that you can scan to OneDrive. I think the most fundamental tool, the most fundamental feature that I learned on my iPhone was sort of when you hold down the space bar, you can move the cursor. And it just seems such an obvious thing that you could be able to do. And I could just see that from a productivity standpoint. I'm constantly drafting something. I'm like, oh, this is so much easier. It makes my life so much better. And how can you do that in an organization? I think that's that's a really interesting goal especially for the alignment of training and IT and innovation and print management. So David, let's go back to you for risks. Like, what are those risks for firms pursuing? Obviously, tool's not a strategy, and tool's not a solution. A solution's not a strategy, but like, what's the risk for law firms that are pursuing the latest tools before doing exactly what Mike said at the outset when you're creating foundational readiness, which is really positioning the organization so that it can build as opposed to have to not have money for the first time, but have money the second time?
Well, it's certainly the cart before the horse analogy, isn't it? So, and I think the pressures generally come from the partnership, senior management, that whether they've read something in a magazine, visited another law firm that's doing something different, and they come back and just ride the CIO saying, hey, we need the latest tools here. We are not modernizing because we haven't got the latest stuff. And buying the latest tool doesn't mean you're modernizing. But in some eyes out there, it's we need the latest. And risks emerge in doing things in the wrong order or misplacing priorities. The case of a firm that adopts new tools without first addressing fundamental workflow inefficiencies, all they're going to be doing is compounding the problems rather than solving them. It's like buying a high performance car and learning how to drive. You might not even have a driver's license. So it looks impressive. Hey, it looks great in my driveway, but you're not going to get far. But at worst, you're going to crash the thing. So fix the basics, ensure the processes, integrations, compliance, user acceptance. I echo what Mike's saying. We're kind of sounding like broken records here, like just focusing back at that foundational level and fixing up the basics and ensuring you've got all the security risks, the integration challenges, and dealing with the adoption resistance from your users. Because if you're rolling something out and they just don't get it, they're not going to use it, and they're going to start creating their own processes, shadow IT, and it just compounds the problem. So that's far from modernizing your platform.
Well, so let's look ahead. Let's try to wrap this so that people can understand what the advantages might be for cutting certain costs, making certain investments, strengthening certain infrastructure, and improving consistency. Mike, you are with a global organization. You mentioned the ability to print wherever you are, whether it's in your home office or abroad. You mentioned this idea that organizations are growing, they're taking on new offices, there's redundant infrastructure, there's outdated infrastructure, there's teams that lack certain training or teams that are particularly well trained, but there are not enough of them. What aspects of this as a firm is growing, as it's creating alliances with organizations that maybe active on a global level, maybe it's tying up or merging with other organizations, which is a big trend that we're seeing obviously now in this particular market. How can firms avoid some of the challenges that we're discussing, and what should they be doing aside from the foundational things, aside from the modernizing issues we've talked about, in an effort to sort of position themselves really well for the future?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a quote unquote aside from the foundational issues for this particular topic. I will say it is important that IT leaders partner very closely with the business leaders. I think that is something that sometimes can be a challenge, right? Because our clients, our end users, they want to bill, and pulling them into business decision meetings and tying up time in that aspects takes them away from their opportunity to generate revenue, and that is a challenge, but it is a critical path issue. It's because it's how we understand regulatory, it's how we understand client requirements. Some cases I've dealt with in the past, client doesn't want their data, any data produced for them to leave their particular jurisdiction. And so that's a technology challenge, but it's important for IT to understand those things so that when we're evaluating tools, or when we're analyzing it against the capability of our current tools, we have that information. Again, and trying not to avoid plugging at groups. I think this is going to be my third time, but this is an area of expertise that they have. And I think that sometimes, whether it's budget constraints or what have you, we try to avoid bringing in third parties to help advise. But this is an area, that group has a good cross section of multiple law firms. I can't remember who it was, but I think Ari, it might have been you said, but talking with multiple law firms and your peers in this area to understand what they're doing, and kind of that groupthink situation, or that collaboration to give you ideas. And I think that's where somebody like At Group can come in and give you a good cross section of what's available, what other firms are doing, and then help your organization and guide you into these areas for planning factors, so that you can mitigate. You're never going to get 100% out of it, right? There's always going to be challenges. You're always going to come up to some level of risk, but having expertise is critical.
Peter, as someone with that expertise that Mike is emphasizing, just thinking about making these decisions and not having an unlimited budget, an unlimited time, an unlimited team, should law firms focus on investing in new technologies or focus on better controls to integrate what already exists?
Honestly, Ari, I think it's a bit of both, but it's also a bit of neither, right? So I think when you're looking at this, a lot of this comes down to, Mike keeps talking about the foundational elements. I think you need to look at what is the direction and what is the policy aspect of this that we're trying to achieve. And you need to start with that. And then what tools do we already have in place that will help support us on that direction? Where do we have gaps? Where do we need to fill those gaps with different technology? And then I think the other part that is just critical, and we've talked about it a couple of times, is the change management aspect, right? I mean, having all the tools in place, but not giving them the why, not, what's in it for me, and recognizing the different audiences within the firm, that what's motivating a legal administrative assistant might be a little bit different than what's motivating a partner, and having that combination of workflow efficiency and financial advantages of the solution are going to help to drive that direction that you're ultimately trying to achieve.
David, global strategy, does that influence decisions at an infrastructure level? Where are you making these choices, and how do you kind of prioritize what to do first and where the impact is?
Well, a global strategy not only influences the tech decision, it should drive the tech decision at the infrastructure level. Shaping how the firm approaches scalability, access, security, and interoperability. I've seen many firms adopt the use of software as a service to achieve this, because getting that consistency across regions, trying to do that with on-premise systems is difficult, because you've got to create almost clones of the environment. Whereas if you start relying on cloud and edge computing, this gives you that consistency across different regions and different offices, and it optimizes the performance for different regions. Cybersecurity, risk management, it's how do you maintain the consistency if you're not applying a global strategy to your network and infrastructure architecture? And to build this is, depending on the scale of your firm, is going to be almost impossible if you're going to build your own tools. So you have to start relying on, your cloud services, your software as a service products to give you that consistency across, the global regions.
Mike, I just want to give you the last word here, because you made a point about buy-in, about how important it is to get support from a range of individuals who are making decisions. Any suggestions for how to do that? Engage those folks in conversation. I'd love to give people just an opportunity to apply your wisdom to their particular approach.
I think first and foremost is putting together the business plan and the business value assessment. I think that helps you walk yourself through the process and understand the solution you're trying to put forward. I think that getting the voice of the customer is critical, and understanding, not for your entire user base, because that's not achievable, at least effectively, but understanding where your revenue comes from, your majority of revenue comes from, starting from there, and putting that into your business value assessment, and then starting to socialize that, getting feedback from your other business groups, not just the legal practices, but also your HR teams, your finance teams, because they're going to be consumers of these products. And I think sometimes they get left out of the equation, but they're just as important to the function of the organization. So starting with those components in a plan, and then as it gains traction, then it gets bubbled up into your executive committee level folks, where you're presenting a business strategy that can make an impact on the organization.
Amazing how those points and those recommendations echo the features of great leadership. So thank you, Mike, Peter, David. It's really been a privilege. Thank you all so very much, and thanks to the ACT Group for giving me this chance.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Ari.
Ari. Appreciate it.
Thank you.